Good morning. Welcome to this public panel on climate finance and green transitions in a turbulent world. We're very pleased to co-organize this session with the Policy Network for Transitions. Thank you to Hamza, Dean, and the Kinsey team for their partnership. And thank you all of our workshop participants as well as speakers joining us. This panel closes the workshop by widening the discussion. Over the past 2 days, we have looked at green industrial policy, financing constraints, and development outcomes in North Africa and the broader global South. This panel connects those discussions to the wider international environment in which green transitions are now taking place. There are 3 parts to that environment that we want to examine today. The first is the growing role of Gulf capital in green transitions across the global South. The second is the role of China in green technology, manufacturing, infrastructure, and supply chains. The third is the recent war on Iran and the Gulf, which has shown how quickly energy, food, shipping, and finance can be disrupted. So the question for this panel is how countries in the global South can navigate this more turbulent environment while protecting their own development. We'll begin with a short opening remarks from each speaker and then move into moderated discussion before opening the floor to questions from Blumen who's joining us. I'll just briefly introduce our speakers. We have 6 excellent speakers with us. Nora, Shadi, Professor of Economics at Cairo University. Dawud Ansari, Gulf Community Member of the Rihla Initiative. Lydia, Bouazati, Middle East and North Africa Council Member for the Rihla Initiative. Hamza, Meddeb, co-founder of the Policy Network for Transition at the Carnegie Middle East Center. Iskander Erzini, founder and director of the Rihla Initiative for Climate and Development, as well as Matthias Larson, who's joining us as a senior policy fellow at the SC's Grant and Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. I will first start with Hamza. From a political economy perspective, how are green transition agendas reshaping development strategies across?
Thank you, Mehran, really for taking the initiative to organize this public event, and we are really happy. And the Policy Network for Transition to partner with the Rihla Initiative for this event. Actually, I think today many countries, and especially the North African countries, they are facing a crucial moment where they do need to rethink their development models. Old models based on cheap labor, tourism, remittances, extraction of natural resources cannot meet the needs of the societies of the economies. And I think the green transition is offering actually an opportunity. There are sure some opportunity to be seized, but at the same time, in these countries, many of these countries, they have to avoid repeating all the mistakes. This is one crucial thing to I think the debate in many of North African countries is ultimately not to participate or not in the green transition, to seize or not the opportunities that are raised by the green industrial ambitions, actually, and the green industrialization, but how to participate. The challenge for many of these countries is to reshape their development model in a way that could allow actually creation of growth, but also in a way that could be economically sustainable and socially just. Now, whether Morocco, Tunisia, or to a lesser extent Algeria, I think many of these countries they are facing actually crucial challenges. The first of them is designing industrial policies in order to navigate these transitions and to be able actually to position themselves to benefit and to capture these opportunities. There is already an industrial basis that exists in these countries, but what is really lacking is the capacity to plan, the capacity to strategize, to coordinate policies, to implement. And this is the big difference, actually, that many countries have, that is making a difference between many countries. We see that this capacity and state capacity to strategize and to plan is playing. The second challenge is how to finance, how to access to finance. especially that the fiscal space is very limited in the case of Tunisia and in Morocco, of course, and that with high spending, social spending, spending in many in public spending actually that is politically also driven and giving very short and very limited space for investing. And the third, I think, challenge is how actually to insert these economies in ways that allow the sort of industrial trading, creation of value, an upgrade of the human capital and skills, so they cannot really be locked into a role of a pure exporter of energy. I think the model of financing, the models of financing are extremely important because when we see the situation, for example, see that in many ways debt and the conditionality related to the financing, the concessions are dependent or related to the risks of depreciation of the dinar or to the the risks of inflation, etc. And there is clearly a transfer of risk actually with these conditionalities to the country and to the population actually in a way. The second thing is how to upgrade actually the infrastructure of the grids, how to modernize actually the SOEs, how to make sure that local communities can benefit, how to make sure also that education and investments in the human capital can flow and can really be beneficial to the communities. And this is really a challenge that Tunisia and other countries are really addressing, and they have actually to tackle in order really to be active and to benefit from these things.
Thank you very much. That was a great intro. And it allows us to turn to Nora from an Egyptian perspective. What are the main risks of treating green transition sectors as export-led opportunities without sufficient attention to domestic demand, affordability, and social development? And what can we do to be?
Well, thank you. It's a very interesting question. It's very important that we bear in mind that transition is not only a green transition and is not only a digital transition, which should accompany the green transition, and the energy transition in the narrower sense, but it has also been promoted for as a just transition. And it's important that we reflect on the winners and losers of this transition and for whom the transition is a just one. Is it for those who import the green energy and the green industrial products? Is it for those who export, or can it be for both? And the elements that I'm going to mention for Egypt also largely apply to the rest of the region, to the rest of North Africa. The main risks of treating the transition as a key factor into an export-led growth without incorporating these into an industrial ecosystem at the local level, produces a set of risks that are risks within and risks between. The risks between are the risks between the exporter and the importer of these green products, while the risks within are the risks within the country itself. So if you start with the risks between Egypt and those market or export market destinations when these products are targeted, there are three basic risks. Risks, first of all, the classic risk of creating an export of that has absolutely no backward linkages with the rest of the economy, with the domestic manufacturing sector, and thereby missing on the opportunity of benefiting or embedding this transition into our domestic manufacturing and industrial sector. This is the first. The other problem is the risk of concentrating the exports of clean energy, for example, or other products downstream of the energy sector, for example, like green steel, fertilizers, cement, and other products as well that are energy intensive. So the risk of exporting these while not benefiting from them locally. And here the question of a just transition pertains to the energy sector specifically. Unfortunately, many of the countries that are now developing hydrogen infrastructure, for example, clean energy infrastructure and seeking to attract investments, want to start, at least in the first phase, in the first 5 to 10 years, with a strategy that seeks to export the clean energy without linking it to the domestic energy demand. And not only is this risky for the domestic energy security, but it's also unjust from an environmental perspective and from a social perspective. The citizens of Egypt, as well as the citizens of the rest of the region, should have access to clean energy because the region is also among the highest exposed regions to climate change. And this is why making simple profits out of the revenues, out of exporting clean energy, while the rest of the population will be exposed to the effects of pollution, climate change, and the use of conventional energy sources is unjust for the citizens. There's another third risk, which falls within this between category, which is the environmental risk resulting from the transition. We talk about solar plants, we talk about wind energy and power stations, grids, and so on, and we forget that the manufacturing of this equipment itself is not green. So if they are produced locally, they can have severe environmental impacts. The second thing is the water, the impact on water and on water stress. The region is one of the highest exposed regions to water stress and water scarcity. And the production of hydrogen, for example, requires a large amount of water to be desalinated if it's not fresh water, or we should already, or we use already resources, very restricted resources that we have of fresh water. In all cases, this is unjust for the population that deserve access to clean water and that deserve water security for consumption for agriculture. And we're going to talk about water desalination. The process itself also has severe environmental impacts because the chemical residue that results from that operation needs to be treated in a way that does not have adverse impact on the local environment, let alone the land issue. So where are these projects, large-scale projects, going to be established and implemented? And what about the local communities, for example, that live in these areas? Do they get to decide? Do they get to be compensated for potential impacts? How are they taken into account? So these are basically the three risks that that contribute to increasing an unjust transition between the exporters and the importers, while there are also potential social inequalities that could result from such a transition. Because this is a highly capital intensive process that would probably be biased towards skilled labor. So how about our abundance of labor in general, which is not necessarily skilled? What are the policies that would target the labor that we have, which we are endowed? And also at the territorial level, these industries, the green industries, will target not only the skilled labor, but also at the territorial level, prefer urban contexts or urban areas where they can have access to skilled labor. And this will create inequalities also, and eventually social political tensions as well. So all that needs to be taken into account. And these risks need to be properly evaluated before Egypt or any other country in the region decides to focus only on an export-oriented strategy in the green industries.
Fantastic, thank you very much. Already two perspectives in, and we're seeing so many different risks, but also some of them are shared, some of them are not. On the Moroccan perspective, I would like to move to Lydia. How can green transition strategies be designed so that climate ambition is connected to socioeconomic development, industrial policy, and value creation? Where do you see the biggest gap between transition ambitions and domestic capabilities needed to make those transitions developmental?
Thank you for your question, and also I'm happy to be part of this team panel. So I think that there are some blind spots where climate ambition should be linked to the other aspects that you mentioned. And I think we can even move further into thinking of all these aspects as serving each other: socio-economic development, industrial policy, local value creation. And there are some opportunities for that. I would like to mention two examples. First is the potential of decentralized energy production. So in the region, in North Africa, we have this huge potential that should be unleashed and supported. Of course, everyone knows the benefits of renewable energy for non-exporting countries in the region. The decentralized energy has even more benefits. And I'm talking here about medium-sized projects or even small or very small projects, solar rooftops for households and also for very small businesses. Such projects, if supported, would help families decrease their energy bills, small businesses as well, and that means that purchasing power would increase in neighborhoods, and this is an engine for local development and prosperity. But also another important aspect is that many organizations such as the ILO, IRENA, the International Energy Agency as well, have talked about the potential of decentralized energy in terms of job creation. It actually creates more jobs than centralized energy projects. And the IEA, one of its latest reports, has even mentioned 3 times more jobs created. Because each very small project will need engineering, installation, and maintenance. And the other advantage of these kinds of projects is that they are evenly distributed across territories, so it's geographically covers maybe the whole countries, rather than having jobs created really around the centralized projects. The second example that I would like to mention is, I think it was mentioned in a previous panel, and it's about using the rich energy resources of the region as a competitive edge in the local industries. And I'd like you to mention a study that was conducted recently, a pilot project actually, in the textile industry, where some companies tried to recycle the garments. The textile industry, because it's the first industrial employer in Morocco. It's something like more than 200,000 jobs, hundreds of companies. And while thinking about recycling the inputs, is because more than 90% of the fabrics are imported to Morocco. So in these projects where the scraps actually were mechanically recycled, etc., it made more sense in terms of greenhouse gas emissions to export the raw material to Spain to do the yarn spinning, and then bring it back to Morocco, than to have the whole value chain localized in Morocco. And that, of course, accounting for the shipping, the emissions of shipping to Spain and back to Morocco. And in this case, this is because the Spain's electricity mix is greener than, or much greener than Morocco's. So yes, we progressed a lot in terms of being the grid, but I think we should go further to bring the grid to have more jobs localized and more complete value chains within the country.
Fantastic perspectives. Thank you very much. To expand the topic, let's look at climate financing more clearly, and let's move to Iskandar. What are the main shortcomings in the way international climate finance is currently reaching countries in North Africa, but also the wider African continent?
Thank you, Nora. Thank you for bringing us together here today. I will answer your question, I think, which gets at the question of international and external finance to North Africa and the wider region by situating it, I think, in global as well as the regional and continental contexts. So I think the shortcomings are fairly well understood in terms of international climate finance. I mean, I think presently maybe I'll address my remarks mainly around international climate finance in the context of multilateralism and international public finance, but maybe later in the discussion we can get to international private climate finance first. So I think in the context of the multilateral system and international public-backed climate finance, it's fairly well understood that you have big problems in terms of quantity, quality, as well as access to the international climate finance. And I think if you look at the North African and African contexts, you can see that very well illustrated. But I think it's nice to take the chance to unpack what that means at the North African level and the African level, because very often we talk about these things as global abstractions, but it's good to I think stress in very real terms what it means. So I'll pick my words advisedly, but I think in terms of understanding the global context that we're in, climate multilateralism is clearly not an auspicious moment. I think there's maybe different views depending on who you ask about where we are in terms of the multilateral climate process. Some would say it's facing an identity crisis. Some people would say it's facing a crisis, full stop, in terms of the Paris Agreement, 10 years on from its adoption. Our view at the Rihla Initiative that this is coming from a long history of working in the multilateral process with North Africa and other countries is that the weak point of the multilateral process is international climate finance. So it's the finance regime that is one of the main weak points of the climate process in the UN. And interestingly, just as an aside, if you want to see and envision a future where North Africa is united diplomatically on the global stage, look to the UN CCC negotiations on climate finance. Because there you'll see Morocco seated side by side with Algeria, with Egypt, and very much all on the same page. And that's because they obviously face many of the same challenges in terms of financing their climate ambitions, but also because they're part of a wider polity, which is the African continent. And the African continent at large is obviously more heterogeneous, but nevertheless exerts a very strong role in the climate process, and so brings together the North African countries and the African group of negotiators. Which I should say, if we're talking about looking at the sort of concrete examples, the shortcomings of international climate finance, you would be no better than to look to what the African group put on the table in the climate process in recent years, calling for a new mobilization goal of climate finance of 1.3 trillion by the year 2030. What we ended up getting, you can do the math, is 300 billion, not 1.3 trillion, and by the year 2035, not the year 2030. And so, I mean, you can just tell from basic maths the shortfall in terms of expectations versus what's on the table. And what's at risk in this context is, of course, the climate action and aspirations that the developing countries, that the African countries can put forward in their national development contributions, cost mitigation, adaptation, and of course also management has been works to quantify each of those. Although it should be said that efforts to actually quantify the full finance gaps that exist in North Africa are also hampered by weaknesses in state capabilities to undertake those assessments. It entails quite extensive whole government exercises across different ministries, look at agriculture, look at energy. So, there are estimates on the table, but they are underestimates in terms of the actual reality of what's needed. But just anecdotally and qualitatively, I think maybe the Moroccan NDC is the most advanced in terms of quantifying financially the different costs of the different projects and climate ambitions that it seeks to undertake. And even that has a ways to go in terms of developing the detail around that. But concretely speaking, you have, for example, in Morocco, as well as globally, aspirations to phase out coal on timeframes that are consistent with the Paris Agreement. And there we've had prior efforts a few years ago to do this approach to just energy transition partnerships like in South Africa and in other parts of the world, but they haven't advanced that far. And part of the reason is because there hasn't been enough grant equivalent concessional finance put on the table by the developed countries. And things are in a still worse position now than they were a few years ago. You have countries like the UK cutting their contributions to things like the Green Climate Fund by half. And of course, that's something with material consequences for climate action in Africa. There's a forthcoming paper by the Initiative for the Adaptation of Agriculture in Africa, which I think has contributed to. And it shows that agriculture in Africa and its adaptation is massively underfunded. And of course, it bears recalling that Africa as a continent has not contributed to this problem, except in a matter of just a couple of percent of the world cumulative emissions. And these for a finance ministry has very different interests between investing in adaptation, education, healthcare, and the current economic crises and commodity challenges obviously make life no easier. I think in the interest of time, we'll pause there, but maybe
thank you very much. So now I think it's the best time to move to the Gulf. So obviously the GCC states have been particularly very active in North Africa, with Saudi, UAE, and obviously with Pastor and Afghan. So Dawud, in light of the recent war, how should we understand the role of Gulf capital in green transitions? So what shifts can we expect?
Thank you, Mohammed. It's a very timely question. As you mentioned, so we may expect that the Gulf's role in green finance, generally speaking, also in terms of investments, both inflow and outflow, may change substantially as a result of the war. But maybe that's first give deeper vision to get what is the GCC action, what are GCC actors doing in those regards. So we've seen, as you mentioned, international champions such as Moscow, such as Agro. They have been active cross-border, so they started by projects within the territories of the respective country, and then going for realizing limited but more substantial projects in solar energy, wind energy abroad, noticeably in the MENA region, to for instance, also in Central Asia, we have very interesting connections also with other areas, such as China. In most cases, the actions of those national champions will take main place in terms of providing finances and in a limited but in a yet to be expanded fashion take place of the peace process. In the future, that might need to change. Why might that need to change? Well, two things are on one hand, and it's not something that just comes out of the war. Generally speaking, to give that away, we're actually seeing that for the GCC, what the war is mostly doing is accelerating tendencies that have already existed prior to the war. And one of them is the need for a broader economic base and a more larger economic footprint of their companies. So what does that mean us now? Again, the main goal has been to use domestically available capital from sovereign wealth funds and invest it, be it in real estate, be it in companies elsewhere, and similar. Nonetheless, GCC countries have had and still have, will continue to have a rising need for broadening the economic base, particularly to generate local employment in order to be economically more assertive. It will require this larger footprint. What the war has most likely done is consider eventually that a lot that happened in the GCC was supposed to happen through foreign direct investments. So again, one was the exterior invests in the GCC, particularly for investments in renewable energy or green industries and similar. However, these FDI plans, these promises, they were eventually based on perception that the Gulf is a nearly zero risk zone. And investing in the GCC and the GCC Act is something that you can do with the utmost investor certainty. Well, to a large extent, that is still the case. No one is doubting that GCC countries are going to go on default or anything else. However, the idea of invincibility of GCC, the stability in the GCC, it might have been heard. We've seen that particularly strong in sectors such as AI, where, for instance, Iranian strikes hit data centers, and as a result, respective companies, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, they directly scrap plans for further investments. That means two things. So on the one hand, the government might need to relatively will probably rethink industrial strategy. So given that FDIs are not going to be the same, not at the same level, and they're going to be distributed differently compared to prior to the war, what does that mean for which sectors do not stand out as very chance and which sectors do less? And the second thing is the government will need to spend more capital domestically. So sovereign wealth actors, they need to become more active in investing in domestic development. Does that mean that GCC investments and GCC development along with these two streams that they will forsake? No, it doesn't mean that. By no means. The Gulf still has both the aspirations and necessary economic interests to be actors who invest and abroad. However, we will very much see that over the coming years, this spending abroad will be more deliberate, will be more planned, will be more strategic on development, broadly speaking, on the development side. That means that whereas the spending might have been, random, might have been very broad in the past, we will see that development aid, development assistance in the region will be more tied to cases where it's either strategically beneficial or in very good economic case. And there are a couple of countries where you can very clearly find as either of those chance. And on a business side of things, especially where there's investments in clean tech, for instance, in North Africa and elsewhere coming in, there will definitely be an attempt to focus even more on the GCC side of things, to have GCC actors being even more established as the guys who actually do things, and instead team up with international partners when it comes to financing.
Thank you so much. It's a great intro to what we will be discussing further down. But I'll turn to Matthias, who's joining us online. We're very happy to have you to give us the Chinese perspective on basically how is China reacting to the changing global financial and geopolitical environment, and how is it reshaping its own financing of and investments in the green transitions across the South?
Thank you, Miran. First of all, I wish it had been possible for me to join you all in person. That would have been fantastic. I have an 8-week-old baby here that prevents me from traveling these days, but I very much hope to join you guys in the future. I also need to apologize for needing to run off at 12:30. I have another meeting that I have to go to. But I hope that we can all stay in touch afterwards. I'm happy to chat more. So getting to your question, we've heard a number of the panelists indirectly talk about the need for financing. The official top negotiated stuff and the unofficial and the private sector and the public stuff and so on. So let me talk a bit about the Chinese angle on that and how that really constitutes a key window of opportunity for North African countries, and in fact for many countries across the global south, so to speak, to conduct green industrial policy. So at LSE, we have built a database on all Chinese outwards investments in clean tech manufacturing. And there are a number of key facts from this data that really show the scale and urgency of this opportunity. In terms of the amount of investments, China is now doing something like $100 billion per year in investments in clean tech manufacturing outside of the country. The North Africa region over the last 10 years has received something like 20 billion, which is a significant amount. The status of most of these projects is that they were announced in recent years, which means that many of these factories are under construction. They're not operational yet. So within the next year or two, we should see a lot of manufacturing capacity coming online, which will change global trade flows of clean technologies. Egypt has received a lot of investment in solar, some emerging in green hydrogen, Morocco a lot on batteries and EVs. The factories will start running, and we should see more trade, in particular towards the European Union on that. The investments have scaled up rapidly in recent years. Just 3-4 years ago, this phenomenon essentially didn't exist. Beginning in 2023, this has massively gained pace. So this is a new and hence a very urgent window of opportunity for countries to really grasp. It covers all the key green technologies that are normally identified as being central to a global green transition: wind, solar, batteries, EVs, green hydrogen in particular. The Chinese companies are investing in these things across the globe. There are concentrations in certain countries, but it is essentially a global phenomenon across all regions. In North Africa, again, it is mostly Morocco and Egypt. But there have been some projects prepared in Algeria, for example, and across the broader MENA region, there are a bunch in Jordan, Oman, Saudi Arabia, Turkey as well. We essentially see 3 reasons that are central to understand for host countries, recipient countries, to capture this green window of opportunity for doing green industrial policy. One is motivated by access to the host country. A second is access to third-party markets, and a third one is access to raw material input. In the case of North Africa and the MENA region, it is predominantly motivated by access to third-party markets. Both Morocco and Egypt and Turkey have trade arrangements with the European Unions that allow them to trade at a lower tariff than others would be. Even in the case of a CBAM, there's room for negotiation in how to arrange such an access to the European Union market. That, knowing that there are 3 countries that are competing for those investments, creates a dynamic around these competitive pressures and the possibility to coordinate, focusing on certain technologies across these 3 and potentially more countries. The data basically has 3 main takeaways, and that gets to some of the points that have been raised by the other panelists. One is, this is a new role that China plays in a global green transition. When many of these goods are manufactured outside of China, it's easier to deploy them domestically. If Morocco is building batteries and EVs, it's easier to deploy these inside the country itself, not only for exports. It also plays a key role in host country development, and it plays a key role in providing the financing needed. North to south flows are definitely not materializing. South-south, which Chinese flows qualify as, has a much greater opportunity at this point. So what we do, and I do at LSE, is look at this predominantly from a China angle and try to figure out global patterns of how these investments work and how policies can successfully use this as an opportunity to create green industries. I and my colleagues at the China Green Development Lab at LSE are not specialists in the North African MENA region like you guys are. So I recognize that some of the challenges that have been raised by the panelists, Hamza talks about state capacity and Nora speaks about ensuring the domestic use and benefit of this type of investments. It is that local expertise that is needed in combination with our expertise on the China side. So I will just end with that encouragement. With that, I hope that this research and this data that we share can be useful for you guys that are experts on the ground, and I hope that we can find ways to answer the difficult questions on this topic by working together.
Thank you very much. And just to also add that we are partnering with the Rihla Institute to basically replicate their data on Chinese green manufacturing on tackling GCC investments in green across the south. So hopefully we can work more closely on that in the next phase of the initiative starting. Just because you need to leave, I will ask a question of you before you leave. Many, if not all, of the Gulf Pact projects rely on Chinese contractors, technology, and manufacturing for supply chains. How should we understand this Gulf-China cooperation? Is it a useful division of labor, or does it risk leaving host countries with too little control over technology and value capture?
Well, China has a complicated history in that regard. Most known is Chinese financing of infrastructure across the global south. China exclusively relying on Chinese state-owned EPC companies, and in many cases also Chinese labor in the thousands going to build the railways and dams and bridges and tunnels and so on. That method absolutely does not maximize the local country benefits. For the clean tech manufacturing investments, the story looks better initially. It is possible for host countries to first receive the simpler components of these value and supply chains. Vietnam is a good example of that, Indonesia too. And then slowly move up to higher value-added technologies simply by bargaining with the Chinese. It is in the Chinese companies' interest to not transfer technologies to recipient countries. So it has to be an intentional effort to bargain with the Chinese. And the Indonesian case, I think, serves as an example for other countries to learn from. From having a massive natural endowment of nickel resources, something like 80% of global resources, they started with an export ban of raw nickel exports, requiring it to be processed in Indonesia, then moving from that to processing basic materials for batteries, then from that into the batteries, and now all the way into electric vehicles. So taking a one-step-at-a-time approach and intentionally bargaining with the Chinese companies, I think makes it possible to ensure host country benefits are maximized. And there are already experiences of countries that do that well that can be learned from.
Thank you very much for that. Nora, I'll come back to you. So Nora, how countries are being pulled into a new green value chain, linked to Europe, China, and the Gulf. What industrial policy tools are most important if countries want to avoid low value integration? You mentioned the risk, of what can we do to move forward, instead build domestic production, technology, and skilled employment?
Yes, well, the question is not about what we can do. We should ask ourselves first, what do they want? Do they want to simply be engaged in the green value chains, which they are going to be in all cases, given their resource endowments, their geographic proximity to the main clients or to the main importers of green segments of the value chain, or do they want to embed this green transition into their own industrial policy? They want to develop global ecosystems, industrial ecosystems around their potential. So basically, if they decide for the export-led model, I fear they're going to replicate previous scenarios of export-led growth, and they will be stuck in what we call
the middle income country technology track, where they are engaged in specific segments of the value chain without being able to upgrade their participation. And upgrading the participation is not only about doing it more efficiently or doing it with cleaner energy, but actually moving to higher value added tasks that are highly technology and skill intensive. This is the first option. This is what has been largely done in the past, with the exception of maybe some of the sectors where some countries are trying to upgrade now. The other option is to embed this transition, since they are going to be stakeholders in that transition anyway, partners in the transition, to embed it into their own industrial policies. And for that, they need an integrated industrial strategy formulated or developed around green or clean energy. They need to create linkages or the backward linkages with the domestic manufacturing sector, make sure that the investors or direct investments that come to our countries to benefit from the technologies and from the potential also share their technology, as Matthias was just mentioning now. There has to be some bargaining power with the investors also to benefit from that, benefit from technology sharing. Building skills, because the transition means a skill transition as well. It's not only an energy transition, it's also a skill transition. We have hugely talented the population, and they need to be skilled to take part in this transition and to benefit their own economies. There needs to be also a sound institution and regulatory framework enabling the implementation of the industrial strategy, because they exist. But when it comes to implementation, it's always difficult because there are regulatory institutional barriers. And here I'm going to talk not only about the institutional and regulatory infrastructure, but of course, and that's one of the most structural constraints towards proper industrial development in our countries, physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, quality infrastructure, since we started being engaged in highly sophisticated and complex industries. So these are all policies or strategies that should be formulated targeting overcoming these constraints. And we have a huge amount of, or a huge share of small and medium enterprises in our economies. They are the main drivers of economic growth, of employment, of innovation in our economies. These need to be properly linked to the green projects or the green investments, cluster policies, through local content requirements, any other requirements that MENA countries or North African countries could bargain with the potential investors, be it from China, from the EU, or also from other countries as well. So we need to accumulate knowledge and to absorb the knowledge to develop our own global capacities, if we are to embed the green transition into our industries. Awesome.
Thank you very much. So the policy recommendations that Nora just mentioned are very important, but I'm assuming that it's not feasible for all North African countries specifically to be able to follow them. In specific, how do you see it in a political economy perspective? What does the political economy of transition reveal? Who captures the value? Who bears the cost? And who's included or excluded from the
Well, I think over really the these 2 days we discussed really the issue that green transition is usually depicted or described as an environmental issue, technical issue, whereas I think it's a highly important issue. I think that decision makers, states and societies are facing really, tough choices. We see that it's not the green transition is not about decarbonization, it's also about reallocation actually of resources. It's a reallocation of power, so who decides, as you mentioned, and reallocation of development economies, opportunities, sorry. So whether, and I think Matthias was mentioning a very interesting point, Chinese investments in Egypt, in Morocco, and elsewhere, and Turkey eventually. This raises actually a question about whether all these countries can cooperate, can benefit. Nora was mentioning how they can benefit, but also there's a risk actually to see these countries competing and engaging into sort of a race to the bottom and offering exemption, offering land, offering conditions for investments without really trying to attract these green investments and capitalize actually to upgrade their industries and to upgrade their skills, etc. So I think there is a risk there, and there is a risk that needs to be taken into account in terms of capture. Between states, there is a competition on who will be able to capture actually these green investments. Because at the end of the day, we are seeing that the green industrialization or the green transition, it's a matter of domestic choices, but also it's highly driven and highly shaped by external factors of decisions in investments and of these actually competitive environment that has always been shaping the global economy, and especially now with the fragmentation of the global economy, we are seeing on this, and we might see this further in the coming years, actually. So I think one of the challenges for many countries is really to avoid this race to the bottom in a way, and to try to benefit from the green investments, because there are really opportunities, whether through Gulf finance, and I mentioned, the potential reconfiguration of Gulf finance after the Iran war. There are opportunities, of course, with Europe, access to the market, technological cooperation. But to what extent also the relations between the region, between Africa and Europe, will serve both sides and not serve exclusively the European interests. This is a question mark, and there is a need really to make sure that whether through the connectors, the Elmet connector, for example, or with all these projects, that there will be value that will be embedded and developed in North Africa, not really to avoid actually these extractive models, a new form of extractivism that could be called as sort of green extractivism. But also, I think in China is offering actually opportunities, although there are no free meals in a way. There is a global race for competition, access to markets, etc. So strategically, I think many of these our countries in North Africa and the Middle East, they don't need actually sort of strategic autonomy, positioning themselves in a way actually to benefit from these opportunities with different partners in terms of financing, in terms of green or clean manufacturing, in terms of developing their capabilities, industrial capabilities, and avoid to be locked actually in the simple position of supplier, green energy supplier. This is, on the competition maybe on capturing the value or capturing the investments between countries. Domestically, I think that Tunisia, Morocco, and Egypt, they do need really to think their green industrial strategies in connection to the structure of the economy. Really, there is an important need for all these countries to boost the private sector, to increase investments. But this cannot be done in context. We know that these three countries are really suffering from sort of rentier capture of many sectors of crumbs, and the idea that the green industrialization can be sort of niche that will be added to the old structure of the economy cannot work. There is need really to open it in order at least to make this green industrialization, seize it as an opportunity. It's really to think a transformation of the economy. And this is extremely important actually to open it up and to offer opportunities to private sector, to actors, to new actors, newcomers, and avoid actually the old schemes and the old patterns that all these countries have going through. I stop here.
Thank you very much. You touched on a few things that we need to be able to respond also to. So Gulf investors are bringing capital, developers, and political relationships with them, but Gulf states also have their own diversification and strategic supply chain priorities. Having Gulf capital serve both Gulf interests and development priorities of partner countries without.
To combine the two strengths that already over. As you mentioned, the inherent risk of brilliance strategy is not impressive, obviously, in the sector. There's not a means of against the transformation of transportation. There's a means of declaring war with the challenge. Let's take hydrogen as an example to start there. What we've seen happening over the past years is eventually that the agency of countries of global south countries producer hydrogen over the past years has been diminished. Eventually, with the crunch of potential hydrogen demand, what eventually happened is hydrogen turned into this buyer's market on steroids, in which eventually a few countries that might still be in the race to produce hydrogen are competing with one another. And this points to a larger picture that you was starting mentioned. Eventually, when we're going through transformation, there is the inherent issue that technology ownership becomes so much more important. On the one hand, so we provide technologies, and obviously, usually it's not going to be the global south country at first, so we transfer policy in order to make it work, in order to be sure that global south countries are inserted into that. On the other hand, is the demand side obviously. So when it comes to decarbonization, as the should sort of say, mainly from the global south perceive this as the demand from decarbonization tools, be renewable energy or similar, will be from the global north. It's again another reason agency. This industrialization also comes into to your question. And if we talk about something like green steel, or we talk about clean goods, and even more so if we talk about tools for climate change adaptation, these are things where each country might have a unilateral benefit, right? So in order to profit from climate, it might have to adapt to climate change or similar. I don't necessarily need Europe, I don't need the US as a buyer, but I have my domestic market. So where's the development come into that? I do see that definitely that it's the potential of the development as we go to focus less on climate as a sort of say as a domestic issue by simple means of their on the other hand. It also means that creating a more integrated global south economy may very much be on the agenda. Climate tech, particularly adaptation technology, is something that will very much happen. And it's similar to, I don't want people want to use the channel issue, which would take far more time than we have. But then we say, future is more complicated than just doing the DSCs providing technology to see it also. We actually see quite a number of cases where they are operations. Take, for instance, the example that China has been increasingly investing in climate technology in the GCC. So right, so you also have the relation the other way around. And so that means that I know this is probably a very unsatisfactory answer to your question over the time that you have. But what I'm saying here is you jump to things. So again, focus on climate adaptation technology, on general new technology, where there's less of a gradient in agency, perhaps. Third, making even more needed bilateral or triangular structure that make this direct partnership work.
Thank you so much. Dawud actually published recently a very, very interesting article on the topic of to move towards climate tech within the Gulf. But on that point, I'll go to Lydia. What would be a more balanced partnership, in your opinion? A partnership model between Gulf investors and North African countries in green infrastructure or renewable energy or industrial development?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. I think that more balanced partnership would be guided by the shared needs in the region. And here I'd like to talk about the adaptation needs, developing when we think about the region, one of the very first issues that comes to mind is water scarcity. And across North Africa, in Morocco, for example, we have a great deal of knowledge and know-how when it comes to water management, be it ancient knowledge or innovation. And for me, this is a sector where the Gulf would benefit from the knowledge in North Africa and could invest in it. Not only water, but also knowledge and know-how in the agricultural sector, the agri system, and also the HVAC technologies, cooling, air conditioning, etc. And there was an industrial base. There were industries in this area in North Africa that could be revived or this cooling is a huge issue because we will need to buy a lot. Are we going to buy it all from abroad, or are we going to start manufacturing our own products and technologies? So for me, this could be a win-win partnership between the Gulf and North African countries. And when talking about green industry, I would like to include services in it. And I think also about architecture, building, and urban planning, where the region also has a lot of knowledge, a lot of know-how that the GCC would benefit from. And in that, I think GCC money could go into innovation and building up on that knowledge. So these shared needs, I think, would be a good basis to start from. There is also, I think Nora mentioned maybe in the previous panel, the dynamic, skilled, resourceful youth in North Africa. And in a different panel, we talked about the unemployment, important unemployment of this youth. They have a lot of ideas. They have projects. So I would say the GCC has focused on large projects for the moment. I think there is a very good opportunity to also invest in smaller projects, in pilot projects, in startups. Led by these resourceful youth, and I'm sure these would be very very promising.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Iskandar. The term hasn't come up today, bankability, but it's something that it continuously comes up in every discussion we have. So how can climate finance frameworks better integrate adaptation, loss and damage, and resilience into the financing of green transition?
I thought you were going to ask me about bankability, and I was prepared to launch into a conversation.
I don't know what.
No, I mean, but I do that and I come back to loss and damage later. Yeah, I think in this context, I mean, I've spoken about international public finance, and people spoken about other external private investment. I think it's worth taking a moment to talk about, particularly in those countries that actually have domestic pools of very deep capital markets, comparatively speaking, to look at the potential for domestic private investment. I promise you I'll get to loss and damage later. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of what countries can do to seek to mobilize local capital, I think obviously it's become trendy these days to talk about platforms for mobilizing finance. Country platforms being a concept that came out of the G20 space with motivations around originally like donor coordination, but latterly has come to really focus on the agenda of scaling private investment for climate. The example in North Africa that's most well recognized is that of Egypt, that has its platform on the nexus of water, food, and energy, called the WEFI platform. I think that's an interesting example to look at, and we see the EBRD played a key role in that example. It wouldn't necessarily look the same in other countries if it was to be replicated. But of course, you have other examples in other parts of the world outside of North Africa, other African countries, African American, Asian economies. Interestingly, in Morocco, the conversations have started recently, and I think it's a good conversation that's being had. It's still in the early stages, but as a think tank, we've been involved in some of those going back to last year. I think it can be considered maybe within the sort of long-standing problematic the policymakers have sought to address of how do you connect pools of institutional capital that have an appetite or sometimes even a mandate to consider social returns on investment to support the policy objectives in development or climate. How do you connect these pension funds, these insurers nationally to invest better in projects within the country? And this is not just developing country problem. You have developed countries that look to these high income countries that would try to solve this problematic, and no one's really perfectly cracked that problem. Although you have some interesting success stories here and there. But just to say that interestingly, one example that you have in Morocco, which is positive, which exists in a number of other African countries and North African countries as well, is you have publicly managed asset managers, essentially, so public entities that do investment and that manage as fiduciaries, pension funds on behalf of not just state employees, but also even private sector in some cases. So you have, in the Moroccan context, the CDG, the Caisse de Gestion, and in other African countries you have similar institutions, and you have criticisms these days of what happens when you have private management of pensions. Now that might lead to sort of continued non-socially useful investments in secondary equity markets, so things that might be fairly detached from the sort of real economy agendas. But this is, I think, a positive example where you have these investors that double as national development banks for in-country development finance institutions, and that have actually got quite an impressive track record of backing important infrastructure projects across the country. So, I mean, we've heard a lot about billions to trillions. This is not billions to trillions. It's more like billions to more billions. But I think given the challenges that we face, it's that whole agenda of mobilizing institutional capital and savings. We could go on and on and talk about it. I won't, but just to say that I think it's a very important frontier to be looked at in the North African context before even seeking to look to foreign investment. When you have capital that is looking to invest, trying to solve some of those problems. It can also be, it's not mutually exclusive, looking to external investment as well. But there's a big opportunity there and want to look at that purpose.
Thank you very much. Hamza, what should North African governments ask for when negotiating with Gulf countries, or with the Chinese, or with the Europeans, or with the NDB-backed financiers? Can competition between the EU and China and the Gulf improve North Africa's bargaining position, or will it deepen?
Well, I think that the North African countries, they need to make sure that this green transition will not end up by giving birth to only sort of several, project, isolated, export-driven, etc. So there is a need to start with really trying to design ambitious, industrial policies or green industrial policies. Have a plan. I think the big difference today between many countries in the region is between countries who have a plan and others who haven't. That's why we are seeing maybe three big trajectories in the region. Those who have visions, who try to implement, to coordinate, to strategize, etc. Whether they will succeed or not, we can assess their achievements or not. But they do have certain aspiration really to transform things. Those who are who to keep the status quo, and this is typically the case of the countries who are really highly dependent on brand, achieving etc. I think the political factor is playing an important role, keeping the status quo and expanding the fossil movement, say. And there are another set of countries or another group of countries who are into sort of really denying, postponing, trying to follow, but without really follow the trend, but without having a coherent strategy. And I think this is really an important, a big difference between countries and their capacities to seize these moments, to negotiate actually. To have a plan is to identify needs, to identify the asks actually, and to have clear asks and to have a strategy. We discussed yesterday the idea to have, to develop an industrial policy through ecosystems. And there are actually some achievements that have been made even more elsewhere. So I think having a plan is the first step towards really having improving the capacity to negotiate with other partners and international partners. Because at the end of the day, there are actually opportunities with the EU, with China, with the Gulf countries, but there are also constraints. And the whole challenge is how to manage actually these challenges and these constraints in order actually to really to make this collaboration. But again, the threat or the danger or the big risk is really to end up being blocked to a symmetry relation, because the colleagues mentioned it. We are in the middle of the transition that is really shaped by technological asymmetry and financial asymmetry. And these two things are extremely important for countries that want really to seize these opportunities, to solve their economies, etc. I think Nora mentioned the idea of being trapped into the middle income and technological trap in a way that there is also another risk that many countries need to be aware of and need to have a plan actually to accelerate their transformation in order to avoid this transition plan, especially that we are seeing the rise of green protectionism everywhere, that the competition is tough, that the money coming from the Gulf is to come actually for bankable projects, that is really looking for, opportunities. But here, many countries, they do have the need to integrate this financing and this funding into long-term projects. I think that will make a big difference between countries who will succeed or who have the potential to succeed and those who will miss the point of opportunity.
Thank you very much. I will ask my last question from Nora, and then we will open it to questions from participants here. Now, please raise your hand. So, green industrial policy has also become an economic security strategy. Countries may try to position themselves as connector economies between Europe, the Gulf, China, and within Africa. As Ansari mentioned in his remarks, the cooperation between North African countries within the UNF triples the context and the negotiations. but that doesn't really exist much beyond there. So how do you envision the future of regional integration in North Africa? Are there any meaningful efforts for closer economic or energy integration?
Tough question whether there are meaningful efforts at the moment is the question that we should leave to time. Maybe we can very briefly comment on what could happen and what is less likely to happen. In the ideal scenario, most African countries, or countries in general, should understand that they are, although they have very similar economic trade structures and also similar endowments, they will still not really compete to the extent of rivalry, but really build on their similar challenges, their similar potential to build complementarities and act as one region, increasing their bargaining power vis-a-vis other blocs like China, like the EU. Since we're talking about the green transition, a just transition, energy security as well, the region suffers from threats to energy security. That's for net energy importing countries, and net energy exporting countries are also very vulnerable to global shocks. So the question of energy security is there, and in an ideal scenario, building energy infrastructure in the future, also green energy infrastructure, would increase energy security in the region. And around this regional cooperation in energy, investing in industrial specialization, where Egypt, for example, could build on its strategic location and logistical capacities, where Morocco could specialize in specific segments of the value chain that are high technology intensive, like the automotive or aerospace sector now that it's being green, where Tunisia could specialize in segments in the skilled labor. This specialization in these green sectors in the future would create economies of scale, and that would be beneficial. So instead of being redundant, it would be complementary and benefit from economies of scale. That would increase the ability to transform our economies, increase our bargaining power as well. Now, being realistic, how do we do that with the persistence of political conflict in the region? Be it in the East Mediterranean, but also be it between Egypt and the rest of the other countries because of the political instability in Libya. So how do we want to build the infrastructure in the region that is being affected by a quasi permanent nature of political conflict? Other than political conflict, there are definitely also political disagreements, political tensions between the countries and themselves. And in a very dark scenario, we saw here, as Hamza mentioned, I can only second Hamza when he said, we will just turn this competition and this potential into a race to the bottom, where we are giving unconditional concessions to investors, repeating ourselves, and actually not fully reaping the benefits of such transition.
Thank you very much. Dawud, do you want to add?
You would just like to ask that I know this very important point and say experience is not just one of the Africa as well as communities of other regions, including the GCC itself, where the political integration has been going on for decades. Economic integration we have to have on paper, but economic collaboration, coordination is perhaps been all time low. And eventually this question of how can we actually integrate entire regions as a specialization and to self-distribute value supply chains is a really major quest. Actually, even if we look into literature, how exactly we can do that, that is still something we actually need to actively find out which mechanisms how to do that. And most likely the avenue that we're going to go down is one where we create mechanisms on a regional basis that foster co-investment in order to create a system of co-shared responsibilities but also interests.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions from the audience? Using this. Yes.
Thank you so much for the interesting contribution. My comment and question is directed to Dawud. It's been quite interesting to listen to the perspective of GCC over the past yesterday and today, and perhaps I'd like to highlight a bit of a critical perspective. I'm really glad you framed it as a turning point. Now GCC is in a turning point after the war in Iran, and also the fact that GCC now reconsidering its strategy of investing abroad versus inside the country. And I would really hope that this happened, but I believe that GCC logic of investing abroad is quite existential, and I don't think it's gonna decrease soon. For example, in the sector of agriculture, GCC doesn't have, or relatively small countries, they don't have water and arable lands, so their strategies after 2008 has been basically land grab lands abroad, and this has implication, of course, for water in the host countries of these investments. So yeah, I think I'll frame it as existential. So I don't think they would go back to investing inside GCC. And yeah, you also said that the investments abroad have been quite random. I'll also add that they have been quite extractive. You said they were random, but I also add that they were extractive. And I think my second comment is that in GCC now, before Iran war and now after, we are seeing noticeable investments in military and AI technologies to serve military purposes. And this is bluntly a dark side of industrialization, or if we're talking about industrial policy. Yeah, and I would assume that the Iran war would accelerate the sense of survival. So yeah, I think my question is there a chance in this turning point for GCC strategy to become or consider more collaborative and developmental logic, or are we heading to GCC being basically like disruptive force in it? Thank you.
Please give us a shot.
Yes, very quick, don't worry. So thank you very much for the panel. This is just to make a small caveat to a narrative that was shared today and I believe yesterday as well, around how the crisis is propelling this transition prospects and ambitions in the region and globally. And we've been monitoring the situation quite closely and how governments are responding to the crisis. And while by and large, yes, we do see an uptake in transition talks and in some cases even measures being undertaken, we equally see some countries taking pretty strict protectionist energy policies, whereby countries would rush and prioritize securing fossil fuel reserves in anticipation of the crisis going even forward. So I think this begs the question of how green truly is this transition when we don't have mitigation mechanisms for these crisis scenarios and emergencies, so that every time there is a disruption in the global energy markets, we fall back to relying on fossil fuels. And in conjunction, how resilient really are there? For example, when in the case of the EU, they are still planning to rely on external countries, North Africa, to get their renewable energy to them, and this puts it in the prospect of the export angle, truly defeating the case for renewable energy.
Thank you for the question.
This was a general remark because this has been shared, I think, yesterday and today as well.
Would you like to respond to that?
I'll start with the first one. Let me first acknowledge this that the question was general with a number of what called in terms of extractivity to land and similar, some of which I do very much agree with, many of which I don't agree with. is to say that it's start. Let me start with the very normative point that you raised concerning military investments, where I would then again, if we're discussing normatively, I would say that there are lots of very positive development and so on, that weapons are going to more. Every single country is here to develop weapons, and from both the development perspective and security and an agency perspective, it is a very positive development that those weapons are to be produced domestically, and as such, you are increasingly dependency on arms straight from Europe or the US. So much in concerning that one. Then the other point, when I say that GCC investments abroad are going to change, we're perhaps talking to some extent about budget investments, but I'm mainly talking about this standard financial investments, particularly in Western economies, the United States change. Concerning developmental logic present or not present in this project, whether this is going to change, just I think probably talking a very good thing in the next year. We're not going to see sustainability criteria similar for those investments. But again, talking about the broad, so you particularly address the agricultural sector, and here, I mean, to me, in a sense, your question contains a very paradoxical duality that we all found. So if the GCC is half the world's ATM, and everyone is counting and asking what's that investment, all those investments are equal. It cannot be both. And in fact, it is fair. It is a lot of countries that do eventually compete for those investments. If you're asking what those investments could be more collaborated, I'm just to cite one empirical case. Look at Uzbekistan. So look at Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. GCC investments in renewable energy industry that Kazakhstan and highly collaborated with regional actors and are not deemed to be extracted. What I mean to say about this is that yes, definitely we can look at individual cases where GCC investments might have had an extractive nature, and those cases do definitely need to be scrutinized. But I don't see the general pattern that you described to.
Does anyone want to add anything to these questions or generally actions? We're very behind time, so thank you very much for everyone for joining us. Thanks to our speakers and hopefully this. Thank you.